Good day, everybody. My name is Denis. I am a registered dietitian. I have a master's degree in kinesiology, and it was just this past year for my class that I was teaching at the University of Toronto called Nutrition, Athletics, Performance, and Behavior when I started this, what I called the Athletes of Canada Elite Sports Science Podcast. And it was in episode number 6 where I had the privilege of interviewing IFBB pro bodybuilder Morgan MacDonald. And ever since then, I knew that I wanted to do a supplemental video to that conversation on the topic of drug testing in sports. And considering the headlines last week regarding multi-time Olympic medalist Penny Oleksiak, I thought now would be a good time to cover that story as well. Even though I have never ever in my life met Penny Oleksiak, I think it's fair to say, considering the media coverage, that that story is uh, squarely in the sphere of the public domain. And I believe it would be helpful to get a better understanding of this very, very interesting topic, to do a kind of compare and contrast of these two very different sports, that being bodybuilding and swimming, and kind of get a look at how the rules about drug testing applies to each. And I think it's fair to say that the bulk of what I know about drug testing in sports has come from the good people at the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport. Now, I'm not affiliated with them either in any way, shape, or form. All I've done is I've had them come into my class about a handful of times over the years to present on the topic. They do an unbelievable job. Their website has all kinds of a phenomenal, actually, amount of resources. And not only are they the national authority on the subject matter, they are literally the entity, the organization that is charged with administering what is called the Canadian Anti-Doping Program. The current version of which, by the way, has been in effect since January of 2021. And again, just because of the timing at present, it's relevant to mention that they're just about to undergo a brand change as of January 1st, 2026. That organization is going to be referred to as Sport Integrity Canada. Still the same, the same heart of the organization, just operating under a different brand. They have been and will continue to be a not-for-profit organization funded by the government, namely Sport Canada, to the tune of about 80% of their funding, and the rest they make up through their own profit-generating activities. They have a few different purposes, a few different mandates, but one of the main ones is certainly to oversee and implement the Canadian anti-doping program in accordance with all the international standards, which are set by this organization, the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA. They are an independent international agency. They were established in 1999. They create the World Anti-Doping Code, which is basically the standards, the rules, the regulations for all the sports that you see at the Olympics. One of the centerpieces of this is that they establish this document that gets updated January 1st each and every year, which is very, very straightforwardly called the prohibited list, which is basically the list of all the substances that you are not allowed to take. Couple of very relevant points, especially as pertains to the two different sports I said I was going to talk about, swimming and bodybuilding. In the case of Penny Oleksiak, it's not just a matter of the prohibited substances, but wrapped up in all this is the procedures by which athletes are supposed to be tested. As it relates to professional bodybuilding, as well as all the big professional sports leagues, and you know the ones that we all know and love, they are under no obligation to follow WADA's rules and regulations. Why? Because they are their own entities. They are big enough and rich enough that they can do their own thing, as opposed to the sports that we regularly see in the Olympics. You name it. If you are a judo athlete, if you are a kayaker, if you're a cross-country skier, the highest stage on which you hope to compete is the Olympic Games. And if you want to get to that stage, then you are going to have to adhere to WADA's drug testing protocols. Now, these big professional leagues, the NHL, the NBA, the NFL, and Major League Baseball, they do have, for sure, their own drug testing protocols, and they may even be modeled after WADA, more or less. But again, they are under no obligation to be WADA compliant. And so, what I would like to do, because I think this is really, really interesting, is start with a very, very kind of like a nuts and bolts analysis and get to the philosophical reason as to why any sport, whether it be bodybuilding, whether it be swimming, or any sport, would make the determination that something is going to be illegal. And this little slide that you're seeing here again is something that I adapted from what I learned listening to these presentations from the Canadian Center for Ethics in Sport. I've shown this slide in my classes many times and used it to do a little thought exercise with the group. I think it's a great device. It's very thought provoking. And it goes like this. When a sport is deciding whether or not something should be banned, there are three questions in the criteria that they need to evaluate. And they are as follows. Number one, does this enhance performance? Number two, does it pose a risk to the athlete? Maybe the most interesting of all. Number three, does it violate the spirit of our sport? And let's go through the exercise. First, using the sport of bodybuilding. And needless to say, the item or the substance that is most associated with professional bodybuilding that we are going to apply here using our three criteria is anabolic steroids. Now, just as a quick preamble before we get into the three criteria here, when I had this conversation with IFBB pro bodybuilder Morgan MacDonald, he was very candid and open in talking about his steroid use. And some people that I talked to about the interview, who heard the interview, they found that kind of shocking that he would be so open about it. Undoubtedly because of all the taboos that are rightly associated with anabolic steroids. But really, honestly, the only way you could find that shocking would be if you really don't know about professional bodybuilding, especially nowadays in the internet age. I think the more common thing actually would be that they would be open in talking to you about the steroids that they've used to achieve these incredible physiques. Because getting to criteria number one here, do they enhance performance? Slam dunk, 100% certainty, no question, no doubts about it. Yes, they enhance performance to the point where probably 100% of the athletes you see on the highest stage are taking anabolic steroids. They enhance performance. It might be kind of an interesting flip on the morality of this. The more immoral thing might be for them to deny that they're taking steroids. Because if you put out there to the world that you achieved this kind of physique, quote unquote, naturally, well, you're just simply being untruthful. Anyway, let's move on to question number two. Does the substance or practice in question pose a health risk to the athlete? And in the case of anabolic steroids, let's just go with the short answer. Yes, they pose a health risk. But am I allowed to try to unpack any nuance in this question? Or are we do we just have to leave it at yep, they're very, very bad, and there's no further nuance needed. I actually tried to do this in the original conversation with Morgan, and I felt super guilty about even attempting to do it. However, honest to goodness, I do believe there is value in trying to do it because there's always value in trying to get to the truest statements. So let's go with steroids pose a health risk, and that's great if all you want is a 5-word answer. But a couple of the main points that I was trying to get at, which I will now double down on. One of the main ones being just the blanket statement of steroids is really betraying your ignorance, because this is a very, very broad family of drugs. There's many different types of anabolic steroids, and like any drug, they have different profiles of their effects and their side effects. They're different. And the second enormous consideration is that age-old pearl of wisdom: only the dose makes the poison. So there's an enormous range of doses that steroid abusers might avail of, and the negative side effects are going to be contingent upon the size of the dose that you give yourself. And so, although what I'm trying to say is that the question might be a little bit more complex than it superficially appears, you could have a 3-hour lecture on this topic: the health risks of anabolic steroids. But all that being said, I'm quite content to land on the answer to this question being yes, they pose a health risk, to the point where let me even investigate it on the both ends of the extreme here, okay? In terms of the most benign possible risk, why would a sporting organization not want their athletes taking anabolic steroids? Well, on the most basic level, that means your athletes are going to be sticking themselves with needles very often, and that presents a risk. A very legitimate reason why sporting bodies might choose to say, we don't want our athletes to do that. We don't want it to be such that if you want to play our sport at the highest possible level, you got to be stabbing yourself with needles, with contamination, or all the pitfalls that go into sticking a needle into your anatomy. That would be a risk on the lowest end of the spectrum. Now, moving down to the extreme end of the spectrum is where we find the athletes like Morgan MacDonald, who I'm sure if he was here now would wholeheartedly concur. What he has done has to be considered extreme. In any situation in life, I don't think it behooves one's health to be walking around at 340 pounds as Morgan does. And this brings us right to question number 3, which I told you is the most interesting of the 3 criteria. Does this practice violate the spirit of the sport? And very interestingly, to non-bodybuilding fans, you will find that the IFBB, which is basically the professional bodybuilding league on planet Earth, think of it as being the NHL or the NBA of bodybuilding. You think that of these criteria, well, they've got 2 boxes checked so far. Do anabolic steroids enhance performance? Yes. Does it pose a health risk? Let's also go with yes for 2 for 2. But in the eyes of the elite bodybuilding league of the world, it doesn't violate the spirit of the sport, which is really hard for non-bodybuilding people to grasp. Basically, what we have here is an organization that is dedicated to exploring the outer limit of human physiological potential, namely, how muscular can a human being get? And they, if not officially, subconsciously acknowledge we can't explore that without the use of anabolic steroids. I'll say it one more time. I know it sounds crazy to non-bodybuilding people, and I probably can't explain it well enough myself. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read you out something. This is a message that I got from someone who watched my interview with Morgan MacDonald, and I got this note from this person. This person has a PhD in philosophy, and begins by writing, I probably couldn't care less about bodybuilding, but it is fascinating to watch an articulate, informed, and passionate person talk in detail about what they know best. They're talking about Morgan MacDonald, by the way, not about me. They're talking about Morgan. But anyway, this person goes on. To the extent that there is something in bodybuilding that commands respect or praise, it has to be the virtue of self-discipline that it manifests, together with the artistry to which you drew attention in the conversation. The human flourishes when he manifests virtue in action, as Aristotle would say, and this guy found a way to do it. The sacrifice of trivial pleasure for the sake of higher accomplishment brings a sense of satisfaction and self-worth that is lacking in many people's lives. Whatever a person thinks about bodybuilding or any other idiosyncratic obsession a person might have, like chess or gardening or hunting or pickleball, people could learn about happiness from these more extreme cases like Morgan MacDonald. And then the message concluded by quoting Joseph Campbell, who wrote this book, who certainly, if anyone's interested in storytelling, this book has got to be in the top 5 of all-time reads for sure, in my opinion. Anyway, the quote from Joseph Campbell was, quite simply, follow your bliss. Now, one last thing that I need to say before we finish the topic of drugs in bodybuilding, which is quite simply that there are other leagues, if you want to call them that do ban anabolic steroids. The sport is called natural bodybuilding. And what we have in this case is a group of like-minded people who are interested in seeing how great of a physique you can create without the use of performance-enhancing drugs. So when this organization goes through the checklist of evaluating the role of anabolic steroids, we do get a 3 out of 3, not a 2 out of 3. They say, yes, they enhance performance in our sport, which is trying to craft the best possible physique. Number 2, it does pose a health risk. And number 3, in our opinion, it does violate the spirit of our sport. So we are going to drug test all of our athletes. And also, believe it or not, they also use the polygraph, a lie detector for their athletes. And this is why I think this third criteria is so interesting. You have the same sport, but different answers to the same question depending on who you ask. And thus the creation, the existence of 2 different leagues again, if you want to use that term. Anyway, let's move on to Penny Oleksiak's sport, that being swimming. But before we get to Penny's story specifically, I want to use her sport to go through our criteria one more time to illustrate this crucial point about who determines whether or not something violates the spirit of the sport. And the answer is nobody other than the people that are in that sport. So this happened a few years ago. I think it says there 2009 was the year this was going on. And they were deciding whether or not to ban not a substance, but a suit. So the short story is someone had developed these super streamlined bathing suits that basically made you cut through the water faster. And you can apply the same 3 criteria to determine whether or not you should ban this. It's not a substance, it's a suit. Question number 1, does it enhance performance? The answer is yes. Less coefficient of friction going through the water. I don't know what the deal was, but you could swim faster wearing these suits. Question number 2, does it pose a health risk? Absolutely not. How on earth could wearing one suit or another damage your health? No chance whatsoever. And now we come once again to that third criteria, the most interesting criteria. Does this violate the spirit of the sport? And who can answer that? No one can answer that other than people in swimming. Now, I am not one of them. I'm not a swim guy, but I can only imagine the thought process went something like this. We think this is stupid. We don't want outcomes of swim races determined by technology. We want it determined by physical training and the techniques, these exquisitely complicated techniques of the strokes. That's what we are interested in this sport. So they decided we're going to ban these suits. Only 2 of the 3 criteria, but back in 2009, the swim community decided, nope, we don't want these suits. The decision did not have to go like that, by the way. There's a beautiful comparison in another sport, that being the sport of powerlifting. Okay, so in powerlifting, there exists the technology, same kind of thing, suits, whereby you put on these suits, and the structure of the suit and the compressive forces that they engineer into the suits enable you to bench press, squat, and deadlift more weight than you would without wearing them. To the point where the sport of powerlifting has decided they're actually going to have 2 different classes. It's almost like 2 different sports even, where they have raw powerlifting or what they call equipped powerlifting. And at many competitions, the 2 run like parallel to each other. And this is only because the custodians of the sport of powerlifting got together and said, this does not violate the spirit of our sport. In fact, we're going to have two categories and away we go. In swimming, the custodians of that sport said, no, we're not interested in going down the road of these wacky high-tech suits. As Joseph Campbell might say, follow your bliss. And now I'm finally going to start talking about the specifics of the Penny Oleksiak case. And to me, there's two aspects of this story. One is the physiological part of drug testing for swimming, which is obviously of interest to me. But the second part of the story is just the human story. And this is also of interest to me. The reason why I feel bad for Penny is because all the headlines have something or other to do with Penny Oleksiak and an anti-doping violation. It makes it sound like she failed the drug test. But really, the only way you could get that takeaway is if you have an attention span of 1.5 seconds. But the problem with the world is that is what our attention span is these days. But if you have any kind of patience whatsoever to delve a little bit deeper into this, you see that it was not at all a failed drug test. It was what they call a whereabouts violation. Let me go through how this works. Okay, so Penny Oleksiak, as a international caliber athlete, as part of the Canadian anti-doping program, is part of what they call the registered testing pool. Now, people have asked what kind of level of athletes are in that pool, and the answer is surprisingly, it's a broad pool. You don't have to be an athlete the caliber of Penny Oleksiak to be part of the registered testing pool. In fact, there's a couple of athletes, two athletes, that are among the data, I'll call them, on a slide I'm going to show you next, that are currently listed on the anti-doping registry that are, with all due respect to them, much, much lower status than Penny Oleksiak. So part of the obligation of being an athlete at this caliber is that every quarter you have to submit a daily 60-minute availability window where the doping control officer could theoretically show up to test you. There are different ways to accumulate a whereabouts failure. So, for example, you could miss the deadline for entering all your availabilities. You could submit the wrong information, or number three, which I imagine is the worst of the three, is the doping control officer could show up to test you and you ain't there. And the rule is basically 3 strikes and you're out. If you accumulate any 3 of these whereabouts failures over the course of 1 year, then you face the suspension that Penny Oleksiak is now facing. And I do think it is important from the human side of this to get straight what the suspension is for, which is, again, a whereabouts failure. Not that this athlete was taking a banned substance, because from the physiological side of things, my humble opinion, again, I don't know Penny Oleksiak from a hole in the wall. I never met her, but I would have to say that the notion that she was taking a banned substance is pretty far-fetched. And for multiple different reasons, by the way. Don't forget the specifics of Penny's own story. This is a girl who burst onto the scene and won multiple medals at the Olympics at the age of 16. Are we really to believe that this girl, growing up in Canada at the age of 15, was being pumped full of steroids by somebody? I don't buy it. I don't buy it for 2 seconds. Call me naive. I don't buy it for 2 seconds. Let me give you one more quote, actually. That reminds me of a quote. This one's by John Adams, the most underappreciated of the founding fathers of the United States of America. And his quote was something along the lines of, I'll have to paraphrase, but the quote was, to believe everyone is folly. To believe no one is something worse. So I don't believe this girl was taking performance-enhancing drugs. I don't believe it from a human point of view, and I don't believe it from a physiological point of view. Why? Because of data like this. If you weigh, folks, the risk-benefit for a swimmer to start taking enhancing drugs, you will find a ratio that is lacking, especially in comparison to other sports. This is the data that I was talking about. So, a couple days ago, I went on the website for the Canadian Center for Ethics in Sport, and I looked at the sanctions that are currently listed on their anti-doping registry. So, these are all the Canadian athletes that are presently serving suspensions for anti-doping violations. There are 39 such athletes. And from that data that I counted all up, I created this lovely pie graph to illustrate the point that there are like a handful of sports that make up the overwhelming majority of the sports where you are likely to find an athlete get busted for taking performance enhancing drugs. In fact, there were 7 sports that make up 77% of the violations. And if you look at this list of 7 sports, you'll find basically a who's who of sports whose outcomes are directly influenceable by the kind of stuff that performance enhancing drugs can do. Powerlifting. The sport is literally strength. Steroids are well known to increase strength. Football, strength and size. Again, 2 check marks for what steroids can do. Bodybuilding. This, of course, harkens back to what I was talking about earlier. This is obviously is in natural bodybuilding competitions where they do test for steroids. But that sport is, again, literally the accretion of skeletal muscle tissue on the human anatomy. It's a science experiment come to life. And you had better believe we have lots of drugs that can help you do that. How about the sport of cycling? With all due respect to the sport of cycling, I understand there is technique involved, there's strategy involved, but at the end of the day, this is largely about how big of an engine you can create. We have drugs that can help you with that. Maybe not steroids, although they will help as well, but EPO, uh, the drug of choice in that sport. In deciding whether or not to take a PED, athletes in sports like these go through the same kind of cost-benefit analysis as all athletes do, but although their risk is the same, namely they get caught like these athletes and wind up on the Canadian Anti-Doping Registry sanctions list. So the risk is the same, but the difference is the reward is so much more. Maybe I could use my pie chart illustration one more time to hammer home this idea about the elements that go into success in a sport. If you take a sport like swimming or wrestling or ice hockey and made a pie chart of those elements, you would find for sure there would be slices that have to do with pure physiology, strength and speed and whatnot. But there would be far greater slices devoted to things like technique, skill, strategy, things that PEDs are unlikely to improve. And I have one more slide to strengthen this point that I'm trying to make. It's a slide I've used in many, many of my classes. It's from an older study, not that old, but it's a really cool study because they investigated all of the Summer Olympic Games up to the year 2012. So actually, it's only missing 1, 2, 3. It's only missing 3 Summer Olympics. In any case, they analyzed the doping violations that occurred in all the Summer Olympics since they started, since we knew steroids were a thing, 1968 to 2012, and they looked at all the doping violations in those Summer Games. Cut to the chase, what did they find? First of all, exogenous anabolic androgenic steroid metabolites were present in 90% of all the athlete samples. If anyone's wondering the question, what is the drug that they use to cheat most often? Make no mistake about it, it is steroids. And what were the 2 sports most likely to have drug cheats in them? Number 1, athletics, and number 2, weightlifting, accounting for 89% of the violations. So the exact same point. These are sports that are low on the complexity hierarchy, but high in terms of raw physicality. And when that's the case, you have fertile ground for the use of performance enhancing drugs. Not that PEDs would be of no use to an athlete in swimming, just not as much use as they would be in other sports. And so the risk reward ratio becomes unfavorable for an athlete in swimming. In closing, I'll leave you with a few of my own final thoughts about this Penny Oleksiak story. Some more of the human stuff here. So less than a year ago, when I got this idea for the Athletes of Canada Elite Sports Science podcast. So I'm sitting down and thinking about what I would like to do for a structure. We'll have 10 athletes, 5 males, 5 females, and I'm like doing like a wish list of who you would like to interview. Penny Oleksiak all day long is on the top 5 of living female athletes who you could talk to about sports. She has 7 Olympic medals, which quite simply is tied for the most of any Canadian athlete of all time. She was absolutely on my list. And she still is. Maybe even more so. Because now she's got this compelling twist in her story. Again, what a human interest story this is. But the question now comes up, I've seen people like in the media ask, does this change her legacy? And maybe it does change her legacy, but if you think that it does change her legacy, you better have the right information, which is, again, this is an athlete who committed a whereabouts violation. It is not an athlete who got caught taking performance enhancing drugs. Now, that's not to excuse her in any way. An athlete of her caliber who's trying to do the things that she is trying to do is beholden to follow the anti-doping rules. And if you don't, you're going to pay the price. All I'm saying is if you're going to criticize her, make sure you're criticizing her for the right thing. And I guess at the end of the day, that is the main reason why I made this video, to explain as best as I could some of these nuances in the whole process of drug testing in sports. So I guess that's going to be it for me for another one. Have a good day, everybody.